standing beneath million-dollar crystal chandeliers. I smiled as my husband gripped the microphone to destroy my reputation with white lies about my fertility. He had no clue that behind the velvet curtain, I held the hand of a 10-year-old boy with his exact emerald eyes. Tonight, my blood-red gown was a declaration of war. I would not leave until Julian's counterfeit empire crumbled at the feet of the son he had discarded. My name is Elena, and for the last 5 years, I have been invisible, standing on the periphery of the grand ballroom at the Monarch. I watched the cream of New York society swirl around me like champagne in a crystal flute. Usually, I would be shrinking against the wall, terrified of spilling a drop. But tonight was different. At 32 years old, I felt a strange, icy calm settling in my bones. I smoothed the silk of my crimson gown, my eyes scanning the crowd not with fear, but with the predatory focus of a hawk circling a field of mice. The air smelled of expensive perfume, aged scotch, and even more expensive desperation. And there he was, the sun around which these moths fluttered. Julian Sterling, my husband. At 40, he still possessed the kind of jawline that architects used as reference material for skyscrapers. He was laughing at something a senator said, throwing his head back in that practiced, industrial way of his. It was the perfect picture of the benevolent real estate tycoon, the philanthropist, the devoted family man. Only I knew that the man behind the smile was as hollow and cold as the marble pillars holding up the ceiling. The echo of his voice from this morning still rang in my ears, sharper than the clinking of silverware around me. We had been in the kitchen, the sunlight streaming over the untouched breakfast. He had not shouted. Julian never shouted. He believed raising one's voice was for the help. Instead, he had adjusted his diamond cufflinks, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Enjoy the gala tonight. Elena, it will be your last appearance as Mrs. Sterling. By tomorrow, everything ends. I suggest you prepare yourself." A hand snaked around my waist, pulling me out of the memory. Julian's breath was hot against my ear, though his tone was sub-zero. "Smile, darling," he whispered, his fingers digging into my hip just hard enough to leave a bruise. "Try to look useful for once, though I suppose it is too late for that. You will be leaving this marriage with exactly what you brought into it. Nothing. That is the price for failing your one simple duty as a wife." He pulled away, beaming at a camera flash, leaving me standing there with his threat hanging in the air like smoke. My clutch purse vibrated against my palm. One single, long buzz. It was the signal. My private investigator had come through. The package was secure. The fear that had been gnawing at my stomach all day evaporated, replaced by a surge of adrenaline so potent it nearly made me dizzy. "Julian, you simply must tell us about the new waterfront project." A woman with too much filler in her lips shrieked, ignoring me completely. They all did. To them, I was just an accessory, a silent ornament on Julian's arm that had failed to produce an heir. I watched them fawn over him, these captains of industry and pillars of morality, completely unaware that they were worshipping a monster. Their exclusion of me used to hurt. Now, it felt like protection. I was not one of them. I was the storm gathering on their horizon. I remembered staring at myself in the vanity mirror 3 hours ago. The woman looking back had not been the weeping, broken girl Julian expected to discard. I had wiped away the tears and applied a shade of lipstick called Vendetta. I was done being the victim. I was done being the barren wife he could shame into submission. The lights in the ballroom dimmed, casting the room into a hushed twilight. A single spotlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the stage. Julian stepped into the light, his arms wide, looking for all the world like a savior. The applause was deafening. He waited for it to die down, soaking up the adoration. "Thank you," he said, his voice rich and commanding. "Tonight is about legacy. It is about the future. But most importantly, it is about family values. Because without family, a man is nothing. The irony was so thick I could taste it like bile. He paused for dramatic effect, likely preparing to deliver the line that would publicly humiliate me. But I was faster. I caught the eye of the head waiter standing by the service entrance. A man I had tipped $5,000 cash just 20 minutes ago. I gave a barely perceptible nod. The waiter reached for the handle of the heavy oak side door. It was time to introduce Julian to the family values he had been hiding in the dark. 5 years ago. I was living in a studio apartment the size of a shoebox, eating instant noodles and working double shifts at the university library just to keep the lights on. I was 27, exhausted, and desperately lonely. When Julian Sterling walked into the archives section looking for a rare map of old Manhattan, he looked less like a man and more like a solution to every prayer I had never dared to whisper. I was an orphan with no roots, drifting through life like a leaf in the wind. Julian offered to be my anchor. He did not just date me, he campaigned for me. He overwhelmed my defenses with diamond tennis bracelets and nights at the opera. But what really seduced me was the promise of safety. He sold me a dream of a warm hearth and a family table that would never be empty. I was so starved for belonging that I did not notice the cage he was building around me until the lock clicked shut. The wedding was called the event of the decade by the tabloids. I walked down the aisle in a custom lace gown that cost more than my entire college education, surrounded by 500 guests I had never met. I felt like a princess, but I should have realized that in Julian's version of a fairy tale, the princess is silent. The cracks appeared on our honeymoon in the Maldives. We were surrounded by paradise, yet Julian spent 80% of the time on conference calls or directing me on how to pose for the paparazzi he had secretly tipped off. He was not obsessed with me. He was obsessed with the aesthetic of us. He curated my life as if I were a living room in one of his penthouses. My colorful vintage dresses were thrown out, replaced by a wardrobe of beige and cream because, as Julian put it, neutrals projected old money and stability. I stopped being Elena the librarian and became Mrs. Sterling, the perfect, mute accessory. Then came the pressure for an heir. Julian was preparing to run for a seat on the city council, and his advisors had told him that a baby was the ultimate polling boost. He needed to be the great father, the patriarch of a new American dynasty. I wanted a baby too, desperately. But for me, it was about love, not leverage. When the first pregnancy test came back positive, I was over the moon. When I lost the baby at 10 weeks, I was shattered. Julian was annoyed. He looked at the medical report like it was a declining quarterly earnings sheet. He did not hold me while I cried. He just checked his watch and asked the doctor how soon we could try again. By the second miscarriage, his coldness had turned into open hostility. I remember lying in the hospital bed, feeling hollowed out and raw. When Julian leaned over me, I expected a kiss on the forehead. Instead, he hissed that I was embarrassing him. He called me damaged goods. He said I had one job to do in exchange for the life of luxury he provided, and I was failing at it. That phrase, damaged goods, echoed in my head for months. It stripped away the last illusions I had about our love. I realized then that I was not his wife. I was an employee who was underperforming, terrified of losing the only home I had. I tried to be smaller, quieter, and more perfect. I drank the green juices he ordered. I wore the heels that made my feet bleed, and I smiled until my jaw ached at his fundraisers. I thought if I could just be the perfect doll he wanted, the warmth from the beginning would return. I was wrong. 3 months ago, the dynamic shifted again. Julian stopped critiquing my outfits because he stopped looking at me altogether. He began spending nights away, claiming urgent business trips to Dubai or London, but his passport never left the safe. The house grew silent, and in that silence, my adoration finally died, leaving room for the suspicion that would eventually lead me to the truth. The suffocation began 3 months before the gala. It was not a sudden explosion, but a slow tightening of the noose, starting with the digital silence. Julian, who used to carelessly leave his phone unlocked on the kitchen island, suddenly began guarding his devices with the paranoia of a spy. Every screen was locked, every password changed. When I playfully asked to borrow his phone to check the weather one morning, he recoiled as if I had reached for a loaded gun. The paranoia soon bled into the physical world. One Tuesday, I retrieved the mail before the housekeeper could get to it. Among the invitations and magazines was a stark, heavy envelope from a firm called Ironclad Solutions. It sounded aggressive, ominous. I was studying the return address when Julian snatched it from my fingers with a violence that made me gasp. He tore the envelope open, scanned the contents, and then shredded it right there in the foyer, his breathing ragged. When I asked what it was, he turned on me, his eyes cold and dead. He told me to stop prying into business that was above my intellectual pay grade. That was when the coldness turned into open hostility. He stopped ignoring me and started baiting me. He would drop comments over dinner about how a man of his stature deserved a legacy, and how he might need to find a partner worthy of building one, implying that my time was running out. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday evening. I was walking past his study when I heard his voice, low and urgent, leaking through the mahogany door. I pressed my ear against the wood, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Just get it done," Julian hissed. "Handle the boy. I do not care how. I do not want him showing up right now. Not with the campaign starting." I froze. The boy. My mind raced through terrifying possibilities. Was he talking about a blackmailer, a victim, or something worse? I needed to know who this boy was before Julian did something irreversible. I waited 3 agonizing days for my opportunity. It came on Sunday morning when Julian left for his weekly golf game at the country club. I watched his car disappear down the driveway. Then I sprinted to the study. The room smelled of expensive leather and secrets. I went straight to the large oil painting of a fox hunt hanging behind his desk. It was a cliché, but Julian was a man of predictable habits. I swung the heavy frame aside, revealing a steel wall safe. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely steady them to punch in the keypad numbers. I tried his birthday. Error. I tried our wedding anniversary. Error. Then I remembered the one person Julian actually loved, his mother. I punched in her birthday. August 15th, 1952. The lock beeped, and the heavy door swung open. There was no cash inside, no jewelry. Just a single worn manila folder. I pulled it out, sitting on the floor as I opened it. The first thing that fell out was a photograph of a young woman. She was beautiful in a tired, fragile way, with messy hair and a kind smile. She looked nothing like the polished socialites Julian usually associated with. Beneath her photo was a birth certificate. Name, Leo Sterling. Date of birth, 10 years ago. Father Julian Sterling. I gasped, the air leaving my lungs as if I had been punched. I dug deeper into the file. There were bank transfer receipts, monthly payments for a pathetic amount, $500. $500 to support a growing child, while Julian spent that much on a single bottle of wine at dinner. The dates went back a full decade. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Julian had not been the eligible bachelor he claimed to be when he courted me. He was a father. He had a son he had hidden away in the shadows, a secret family he kept on a starvation diet just to preserve his pristine image. He had let his own flesh and blood live in poverty so he could play the role of the golden boy. And now, based on the phone call, he was planning to erase the last loose end. I was not just dealing with a cheater, I was dealing with a monster. I paid a private investigator $3,000 cash to put a physical location to the name in the file. The address he handed me belonged to a zip code I did not even know existed, a forgotten stretch of industrial wasteland on the far edge of the city. To avoid raising suspicion, I borrowed our gardener's rusted sedan, telling him I needed it to transport some sensitive charity donations anonymously. Driving away from the manicured hedges of the Sterling estate and into the gray, crumbling sprawl of the outer boroughs felt like descending into another dimension. The further I drove, the more the world lost its color, replaced by peeling paint and boarded-up windows. The building was a 3-story brick structure that looked like it was being held together by hope and grime. The air smelled of exhaust and wet cement. I parked the car and walked up the cracked pavement, my designer heels clicking out of place against the concrete. I found the landlady smoking on the front porch. She was a woman hardened by life, her eyes suspicious until I slipped her $100 bill. She told me the story in a gravelly voice that broke my heart. The woman in the photo, Leo's mother, had died of cancer 2 years ago. Since then, the boy had been living essentially on his own in apartment 2B, surviving on the meager checks that arrived once a month, looked after only by the reluctant charity of neighbors. I climbed the stairs, the wood groaning under my weight. On the second-floor landing, I saw him. Leo. He was sitting on the top step, reading a library book with a torn cover. He was 10 years old, wearing a t-shirt that was 2 sizes too big and sneakers held together with duct tape. But the face, it was undeniable. He had Julian's sharp nose, his dark hair, and those piercing emerald eyes. He looked up at me, not with the curiosity of a child, but with the weary caution of an adult. "Are you from the agency?" he asked, his voice quiet and polite. I sat down on the dirty step next to him, ignoring the dust on my skirt. "No," I said softly. "I am a friend. Do you know who your father is?" "Leo." He nodded slowly, closing his book. "Mr. Sterling. He sends the envelopes. But he is very busy. He says he cannot come here because of his work." The innocence of his explanation tore through me. Julian was a billionaire who spent $10,000 on a single suit, yet he let his own flesh and blood live in squalor, wearing taped-up shoes, believing that work was the reason his father could not cross town to hug him. It was not just neglect. It was cruelty. The landlady had handed me a letter that had arrived yesterday, addressed to the guardian of Leo. I pulled it from my purse and reread the legal jargon. It was a notice of termination of lease and a transfer order to a state-run group home 3 counties away. Julian was not just hiding Leo, he was erasing him. He was shipping his son off to an orphanage to scrub his record clean before the election. A fire ignited in my chest, hotter and fiercer than anything I had ever felt for Julian. This was no longer just about a failed marriage or my own wasted years. This was about a boy who was being thrown away like trash. I looked at Leo, who was watching me with those familiar eyes, waiting for the bad news he was used to receiving. "Leo," I said, my voice steady and hard as steel, "pack your things. You are not going to that home. You are coming with me." "Where are we going?" he asked, a flicker of hope warring with his fear. "We are going to a place much better than this," I promised, reaching out to squeeze his small, rough hand. "And we are going to make sure your father never forgets you again." The first step in destroying a man like Julian was to secure ammunition that not even his high-priced lawyers could deflect. I took a single dark hair from Julian's silver-backed brush and drove Leo to a private genetic testing clinic across state lines. The 48 hours of waiting were an exercise in agony, but when the envelope finally arrived, the paper inside felt heavier than gold. The results were unequivocal. The probability of paternity was 99.9%. Leo was not just a look-alike, he was Julian's flesh and blood, the son he had discarded like a used wrapper. With the DNA results in my purse, I met Sarah, my former college roommate and now a viciously effective divorce attorney, in a dim corner of a jazz bar where the Sterling social circle would never venture. I laid everything out on the sticky table. I showed her the birth certificate, the DNA report, and the damning bank records I had unearthed. I had traced the money trail and found that the meager payments sent to Leo's mother had not come from Julian's personal accounts. They had been siphoned from the Sterling Charity Fund, labeled as miscellaneous consulting fees. He had been using donations meant for sick children to pay hush money to his secret family. Sarah's eyes widened, a shark smelling blood in the water. She began drafting the divorce petition immediately, citing adultery, fraud, and embezzlement. But I was not done. I hacked into Julian's private email server while he was playing tennis. What I found made my stomach turn. There were chains of emails with his campaign manager outlining a strategy for the gala. They called it Operation Sympathy. The plan was to leak rumors to the press that I was mentally unstable and unable to conceive, painting me as a bitter, barren woman dragging down a saintly public servant. He planned to announce our separation shortly after the gala, positioning himself as the victim of a gold digger. That evening, Julian came home with a thin leather folder. He placed it on the dining table and slid it toward me with a tight smile. It was a modified post-nuptial agreement. He claimed it was a necessary formality to protect his assets during the campaign, but the fine print was brutal. It essentially stripped me of any claim to his fortune if we divorced. He was trying to leave me destitute before he kicked me out. I knew if I refused, he would be on guard. So I summoned every ounce of acting skill I possessed. I let my hands tremble. I forced tears into my eyes and looked at him with pathetic devotion. I told him I just wanted to support his dream, and I signed my name with a shaky hand. He watched me with a smirk, tucking the document into his jacket pocket. He thought I was broken. He thought he had won. He had no idea he had just signed his own death warrant by underestimating me. The final piece of the puzzle was Leo. I took him to a high-end department store, slipping in through a service entrance I had bribed a guard to open. I bought him a tuxedo that was a miniature replica of the one Julian was wearing on his latest magazine cover. As the tailor adjusted the cuffs, Leo looked at himself in the mirror, standing straighter, his resemblance to Julian becoming almost terrifying. I knelt before him and fixed his bow tie. I told him that tonight required courage, that we were going to meet his father, and that he needed to be strong. I then made 3 calls from a burner phone, one to the editor of the rival city newspaper, one to a notorious gossip columnist who hated Julian, and one to the head of the ethics committee. I promised them the scoop of the century if they attended the gala. The night before the event, I lay awake watching Julian sleep. He looked peaceful, his chest rising and falling rhythmically. A year ago, I would have felt love. Now, I felt a cold, exhilarating disgust. I was sleeping next to a corpse. He just did not know he was dead yet. The next morning, the stylist arrived with the dress Julian had selected for me. It was a pale, white chiffon gown, delicate and submissive. It was a dress for a victim. As soon as the stylist left, I threw the white dress into the back of the closet. Instead, I unzipped a garment bag I had hidden weeks ago. Inside was a gown of deep, blood-red silk. It was structured, sharp, and unapologetic. It was the color of war. Tonight, I would not be the white flag of surrender. I would be the fire that burned his world to the ground. The air in the grand ballroom had become a physical weight, thick with the scent of lilies and the heat of 500 bodies. The chatter had died down, replaced by a reverent silence as Julian took command of the room. He stood behind the podium, the spotlight catching the silver at his temples, making him look distinguished and wise. I stood in the shadows of the wings, watching the man who had shared my bed for 5 years perform his greatest role yet. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian began, his voice dropping to that rich, somber register he reserved for fundraising pitches. "We speak often of wealth, of stocks and real estate, but tonight, I want to talk about true legacy. I want to talk about the importance of the future generation. The responsibility of a father is the most sacred duty a man can hold." He paused, looking down at the lectern as if overcome with emotion. When he looked up, his eyes were glistening with practiced tears. "As many of you know, my wife and I have walked a difficult path. We have prayed for a child. We have longed to hear the laughter of a son or daughter in our home. But fate, it seems, has a cruel sense of humor. My wife, Elena." He gestured vaguely toward the darkness where I stood. not even meeting my eyes, has not been blessed with that miracle. It is a burden we carry, a silence in our home that is sometimes deafening. The entire room turned to look at me. I felt their gazes like hundreds of tiny needles. There was no kindness in their eyes, only a mixture of pity and judgment. I could hear the whispers rippling through the tables near the front. They were looking at my waist, shaking their heads, pitying the poor billionaire stuck with a broken wife. He was publicly branding me as barren, using my pain he had caused with his cruelty to garnish his own saintly image. But Julian's voice soared, reclaiming their attention. We must turn our personal sorrow into public good. If I cannot be a father to one, I will be a father to many. Tonight, I am proud to announce the formation of the Sterling Children's Fund. We will dedicate millions to those who have been abandoned, to give them the family they deserve. The irony was so sharp it almost drew blood. He was using a charity for abandoned children to mask the fact that he had abandoned his own child. The applause began, tentative at first, then thunderous. Julian beamed, opening his arms wide. "Elena, darling," he called out over the microphone, his voice dripping with faux tenderness. "Come up here. Stand with me. Let us share this moment." He wanted a prop. He wanted me to walk out there, head bowed in gratitude, the silent, infertile wife standing in the shadow of the great man. I took a breath, filling my lungs with the cold air of the stage wings. I did not shrink. I did not tremble. I stepped into the light. I walked toward him, not with the shuffle of the defeated, but with the stride of a predator. My blood-red dress rustled like a warning flag. The click of my heels on the hardwood stage was rhythmic and deliberate. As I approached, I saw Julian's smile falter for a microsecond. He saw the set of my jaw, the fire in my eyes. He expected a mouse, but a lioness had just walked onto his stage. I reached him and, without asking, reached for the microphone he was holding. He held onto it for a fraction of a second too long, his knuckles white, but he could not struggle with me in front of the cameras. I pulled it gently but firmly from his grip. The room went deadly silent. This was not in the script. "My husband is right," I said, my voice steady and clear, booming through the high-end speakers. I looked out at the sea of faces, then turned my gaze to Julian. His smile was frozen, a rictus of panic starting to form in his eyes. "Children are the most precious gift a person can receive. They are the mirror of our souls, reflecting exactly who we are, and frankly, no one understands that better than Julian." Julian frowned, his body tensing. He sensed the ground shifting beneath him. He reached out a hand, attempting to guide the microphone back to himself. "Thank you, Elena. That is beautifully said, but—" I sidestepped him smoothly, keeping the microphone just out of his reach. I was not done. I was just getting started. "But there is one detail my husband failed to mention," I continued, my voice smooth and lethal, cutting through the stale air of the ballroom. I turned to look Julian dead in the eye. He was frozen, his hand halfway extended toward me, a look of dawning horror beginning to fracture his perfect composure. That is the fact that his most precious gift has been waiting 10 years just to meet his father. I raised my left hand, snapping my fingers. It was the signal. At the far end of the ballroom, the massive double doors swung open with a heavy thud. The spotlight operator, whom I had bribed with $2,000 an hour earlier, swiveled the beam away from us. It cut a path through the darkness, landing squarely on the small figure standing alone at the entrance. Leo. He looked heartbreakingly small despite the grandeur of the tuxedo I had bought him. His hair was slicked back, and his posture was stiff, terrified, yet brave. He began to walk down the long red carpet toward the stage. As he moved closer, the gasps started. They began as a low ripple in the front row and spread backward like a wave. The resemblance was not just strong, it was a biological photocopy. The same sharp jawline, The same dark curl of hair, the same piercing emerald eyes. Leo was Julian Sterling, stripped of the arrogance and the age. Julian turned to follow the gaze of the crowd. The moment he saw the boy, the blood drained from his face so fast he looked like a wax figure. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He was watching his secret sin walk straight into the center of his greatest triumph. I reached down and took Leo's hand as he climbed the stairs to the stage, pulling him gently to my side. I felt him trembling, and I squeezed his hand to reassure him. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice ringing with vindication, "please meet Leo Sterling, Julian's biological son, the son he has been so tirelessly protecting by forcing him to live in abject poverty for the last decade." Julian finally found his voice. "No," he croaked, stepping forward. This is a lie." "Is it?" I asked. I pressed the small remote concealed in my palm. The massive LED screen behind us, which had been displaying the Sterling Foundation logo, blinked and changed. A collective shout of shock went up from the audience. Projected 10 feet high was the DNA report. The words, "Probability of paternity, 99.9% were magnified for everyone to see. I clicked the remote again. The image shifted to a grainy photograph of the crumbling tenement building where I had found Leo. Another click. A series of bank transfer receipts appeared, highlighting the pathetic monthly sum of $500 next to Julian's signature. While Julian was buying $40,000 watches, I narrated, pointing at the screen. He was sending $500 a month to support his own flesh and blood. He let his son live in a place where the heat does not work in the winter, all to protect his reputation as a bachelor. The room erupted. It was chaos. Photographers broke the cordon, rushing the stage, their flashes blinding and relentless. "This is a setup!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking, losing all its polished charm. He lunged toward us, his face twisted in ugly rage. "She is insane. That boy is an actor I have never seen him before in my life." Leo flinched violently at his father's shouting, shrinking behind my red dress. He looked up at Julian with wide, terrified eyes, the hope in them extinguishing instantly. "You have never seen him?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. "Then perhaps you will recognize your own voice." I pressed the final button on the remote. The speakers crackled, and then Julian's voice filled the room, recorded from the conversation in his study just days ago. "Just get it done. Handle the boy. I do not care how. I do not want him showing up right now, not with the campaign starting. Put him in that state orphanage if you have to. Just erase the trail." The recording ended, leaving a silence more deafening than the applause had been. Julian stood center stage, his hands shaking, his chest heaving. The mask of the benevolent philanthropist had not just slipped, it had shattered. He looked around wildly, but there was nowhere to hide. He was naked before the world, revealed as the monster he truly was. The ballroom dissolved into absolute bedlam. It was a symphony of destruction, and I was the conductor. The wealthy donors who had been sipping vintage champagne moments ago were now scrambling for the exits, shielding their faces with clutch purses to avoid being captured in the same frame as a disgrace. A low, angry rumble of booing started from the back of the room and surged forward. I saw the blue light of smartphones illuminating faces in the front row. I knew exactly what was happening. Julian's political rivals were already live-tweeting his demise, capitalizing on the scandal before the police even arrived. Julian snapped. The realization that his carefully constructed reality was disintegrating stripped away the last veneer of his civility. He let out a feral roar. His face twisted into a mask of pure hatred and lunged across the stage toward me. His hands were curled into claws, aiming for my throat. But I had anticipated this violence. Before he could get within 5 feet of me, 2 burly men in black suits stepped out from the shadows of the wings, They were private security contractors I had hired for $500 an hour, and they were worth every cent. They intercepted Julian mid-stride, tackling him to the hardwood floor with a bone-jarring thud. He writhed and cursed, pinned down like a rabid animal, his tuxedo tearing at the shoulder. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply leaned into the microphone one last time, my voice cutting through the noise like a blade of ice. "And just so we are clear," I announced, my voice echoing off the high ceilings, "my attorney will be filing for divorce at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Furthermore, as the court-appointed temporary guardian of Leo Sterling effective this afternoon, I will personally ensure that this boy receives every single penny he has been denied for the last 10 years. As if on cue, the heavy double doors at the back of the room burst open again. This time, it was not a surprise guest. It was the NYPD. I had sent a courier with the evidence of his charity embezzlement to the district attorney 3 hours before the gala began. 2 uniformed officers marched up the aisle, parting the sea of shocked socialites like the Red Sea. They climbed the stairs and hauled Julian to his feet. "Julian Sterling, you are under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and child endangerment," the officer recited, his voice flat and professional. The click of the handcuffs locking around Julian's wrists was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a cage closing, but this time, I was on the outside. Julian looked around desperately, searching for an ally, for someone to save him, but the room was a wall of cold shoulders. Even the young woman in the emerald dress, the daughter of his biggest investor, the one the tabloids whispered was his mistress, was sprinting toward the emergency exit, covering her face with a menu card. The photographers went into a frenzy as the police dragged Julian away. He was shouting, pleading, crying a snot-nosed, broken mess. It was the image that would end his career, his reputation, and his freedom. He was being dragged through the mud he had created, humiliated in front of the very people he had tried so hard to impress. I stood center stage, my arm firmly around Leo's shoulders. We were an island of calm in the storm. As the officers hauled Julian past the edge of the stage, he looked back at me one last time. His eyes were wide with shock and a terrifying realization of his own powerlessness. He looked at me expecting to see hatred or rage, but I gave him something far worse. I looked at him with absolute indifference. The anger was gone, burned away by the totality of my victory. All that was left was pity for a man who had everything and threw it all away for an ego that could not sustain him. He was no longer a titan of industry. He was just a sad, empty man in a torn suit, disappearing into the night. The week following the gala was a blur of flashing cameras and bold headlines. I could not walk past a newsstand without seeing Julian's terrified face plastered on the front page of every major paper. The press dubbed it the Sterling fraud, and the public devoured every sordid detail. The fallout for his business was immediate and catastrophic. The stock price of Sterling real estate plummeted by 60% in 48 hours as investors scrambled to distance themselves from the radioactive toxicity of his name. Contracts were canceled, construction sites were halted, and the empire he had built on lies crumbled into dust. My legal battle was surprisingly swift. Armed with the DNA test, the recording of his threat to erase Leo, and the irrefutable proof of his financial crimes, Julian's high-priced defense team did not even attempt to fight the divorce petition. They knew it was a losing battle. The judge was merciless. I was awarded 50% of the marital assets, along with significant punitive damages for emotional distress and defamation. But the money was just paper to me. The real victory, the one that actually mattered, was the boy. Because Leo's biological mother was deceased and his father was facing multiple felony charges for embezzlement and child endangerment, the family court granted me full legal guardianship. Julian attempted to contest it from his holding cell, claiming I was unrelated by blood, but the judge silenced his attorney with a single, withering look, I was the only person who had ever fought for Leo, and the law finally recognized that. Julian was left with nothing but his shame. He was a pariah, awaiting a trial that would almost certainly end in a long prison sentence. I could not stay in the penthouse a moment longer. It was a mausoleum of cold marble and bad memories, smelling faintly of Julian's cologne and my own past misery. I listed the property and sold it within 3 days. With a fraction of the proceeds, I bought a house in a quiet suburb an hour away from the city. It was a white colonial with a wraparound porch, a big oak tree in the backyard, and a kitchen that smelled of sunlight rather than cleaning chemicals. It was the kind of home Julian would have sneered at for being too ordinary. But for Leo and me, it was a sanctuary. Living together was an adjustment. Leo was like a wounded bird, flinching at sudden movements and constantly apologizing for taking up space. He was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for me to grow tired of him as his father had. But I stayed. We were not mother and son by blood, but we were bound by something perhaps even stronger. We were two survivors who had escaped the same monster, and we were learning how to heal together. We spent our evenings cooking spaghetti, watching old cartoons, and learning how to breathe without the weight of expectation crushing our chests. 2 months after the move, Leo turned 11. I threw him a party. It was not a gala. There were no crystal chandeliers, no press photographers, and no speeches about legacy. There were just colorful balloons, a chocolate cake I baked myself that leaned slightly to the left, and a few kids from the neighborhood he had befriended. When everyone sang to him, Leo looked up at me and smiled. It was a genuine, eye-crinkling smile that lit up his entire face. That moment was my paycheck. That smile was worth more to me than the millions sitting in my bank account. I knew I had to put the sterling money to good use. I took a large portion of the divorce settlement and established a new organization called Leo's Light. Unlike Julian's fraudulent tax shelter, this was a real foundation dedicated to providing legal aid, housing, and education for children who had been abandoned or hidden away by their families. I was finally the woman I was always meant to be. I was no longer a trophy wife or a victim. I was a mother, a protector, and for the first time in my life, I was free. 1 year had passed since the gavel fell, sealing the end of the Sterling Empire. The autumn leaves were turning gold in the park, creating a canopy of fire over our heads. Leo ran ahead of me, chasing a stray frisbee with a golden retriever we had adopted last month. He had filled out, his cheeks rosy with health and his laughter loud and uninhibited. The shadow of the tenement building and the fear of abandonment were gone from his eyes, replaced by the bright, confident spark of a boy who knew, with absolute certainty, that he was loved. I sensed him before I saw him. It was a prickle on the back of my neck, the old instinct of prey sensing a predator, though now the roles were completely reversed. I turned to see a figure lurking behind a cluster of ancient oak trees. It was Julian, but it was not the Julian Sterling who had graced magazine covers and commanded boardrooms. This man looked 20 years older. His suit was ill-fitting and made of cheap polyester. His hair was thinning and gray, and his posture was slumped in permanent defeat. He had been released from prison early on parole, but society had sentenced him to a life of irrelevance and isolation. He stepped out onto the path, hesitating like a stray dog unsure if it would be kicked. He approached us, his hands trembling by his sides. I stopped walking, and Leo, sensing the change in my energy, trotted back to my side. He slipped his hand into mine, his grip tight and protective. He looked at the man who had sired him with zero recognition, zero warmth, only a guarded curiosity. "Elena," Julian rasped. His voice was thin, stripped of its old baritone arrogance. "Please, I just need to talk." I looked him over, from his scuffed shoes to his desperate eyes. "I have nothing for you, Julian," I said, my voice as crisp as the autumn air. "No money, no forgiveness. You spent your allowance long ago." Tears welled in his bloodshot eyes. He took a step forward, reaching out a hand as if to touch Leo, but I stepped in front of the boy, shielding him. "I lost everything. Elena," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "My company, my reputation, my home. Please, just let me speak to him. Let me see my son." I looked at him with a calm that terrified him more than my anger ever could. "You are mistaken," I told him coldly. "You did not lose everything, Julian. You threw it away. You discarded it like trash because it did not fit your aesthetic. You do not get to claim ownership now just because you are lonely. Leo does not need a father who only cares about himself." Julian looked at Leo, desperation etching deep lines into his face. "Leo," he begged, "it is me. It is your father." Leo looked up at him, his emerald eyes the only thing he shared with this stranger, clear and unblinking. "I do not know you," the boy said, his voice steady and cutting. "My dad would never leave me." The words hit Julian harder than a physical blow. He gasped, the light leaving his eyes. He crumpled, sinking onto a nearby park bench, burying his face in his hands. He finally understood the magnitude of his failure. He had not just lost his money, he had lost his legacy. He had lost the only person who might have loved him unconditionally. "Come on, Leo," I said softly. We turned our backs on him. We walked away, leaving him alone in the cold wind, a ghost haunting a life he was no longer a part of. I did not look back. As we walked toward the parking lot, I realized something profound. I used to think revenge was about making him scream. I used to think it was about burning his world down. But as I opened the door of our new car and watched Leo buckle himself in, I understood the truth. The best revenge is not destroying your enemy. It is living a life so vibrant, so full of love and color, that they can never touch you again. It is being happy in a way they are incapable of understanding. I started the engine and drove us toward the sunset, leaving the darkness in the rearview mirror where it belonged, speeding toward a future that was entirely our own. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please comment below and tell me where you are tuning in from. I would love to hear your thoughts and connect with you all. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel Lily Revenge Stories, like this video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach even more people.